After what happened in the Harmony Station, everyone assumed that Jake Murphy would retire quietly to his house on Earth and never be heard from again. People like to wrap things up in neat little narratives. They like to believe that the impossible will only happen once and then the universe will go back to being unpredictable in all the predictable ways. But Jake Murphy wasn't done with the galaxy, and the galaxy, for better or worse, wasn't done with Jake Murphy. It started with a transmission from the Trinor Conflicts region, a part of space so lawless that cartographers used to mark it with the old Earth phrase, "Here be dragons," until some actual dragons from the Draco Nebula sued for defamation. 3 minor powers had been skirmishing over an asteroid belt that contained nothing more valuable than some stubborn ice deposits and a particularly gaudy collection of nickel-iron rocks. Nevertheless, they were ready to annihilate each other over it, because their ancestors had once drawn lines on a star chart with a shaky hand. Ambassador Vexthera, now famous across the galaxy for shepherding the human tornado through a peace treaty, was relaxing with a cup of fermented moss tea when her communicator pinged. The message was simple. "Help, Trinary. Bring human." She sighed, put down her tea, and sent a message to Jake. "Vacation?" Jake responded with a selfie of himself wearing a Hawaiian shirt, holding a surfboard, and standing in front of a volcano that was clearly in the process of erupting. The caption read, "Always room for diplomacy." By the time they reached the Trinor Conflicts region, the situation had escalated from heated words to heated plasma. The 3 powers involved were the Peltar Collective, a species of gaseous beings who controlled their bodies through magnetic fields, the Kit-Hari Alliance, insectoid traders with a fondness for bureaucracy, and the Euraxian Principality, amoeboid creatures who controlled their ships with pseudopods and passive-aggressive comments. "Ambassador Vexthera?" wheezed the Peltarian envoy, a shimmering cloud contained by an intricate web of superconducting filaments. "You must help us." The Kit-Hari claim our ancestors promised them the 3rd asteroid from the left at the last solstice, which is absurd. Our ancestors would never promise anything without notarizing it. The envoy's filaments flickered in indignation. "It's true," chittered the Kit-Hari representative, smoothing down his iridescent wing cases with 2 of his 6 hands. "We have the parchment right here." He produced a document that looked suspiciously like it had been printed yesterday on a standard galactic office printer, the ink still glistening. The Euraxian ambassador oozed forward. "We don't care about the asteroids," it gurgled, its gelatinous form rippling. "We simply can't stand the smugness of the Kit-Hari. Also, the Peltar's particulate matter is aggravating our membranes." Its pseudopods quivered in what Jake would later describe as an amoeboid version of an eye roll. Jake listened to all of this while munching on a bag of dried seaweed and trying not to look too bored. When the 3 ambassadors had finished airing their grievances, he spoke. "Has anyone tried making snow cones?" he asked. Everyone looked at him as if he'd suggested they all join hands and sing. "What?" the Kit-Hari envoy buzzed. "Snow cones," Jake repeated, holding out his snack bag. "The stuff you're fighting over is frozen water, right? On Earth, when we have frozen water and nothing else to do, we shred it, pour flavored syrup over it, and sell it to children at festivals. It's great for morale." He pulled out a handheld device he called a blender and dumped some ice chunks from the contested asteroid into it. Moments later, he was handing out brightly colored cones of shaved ice to 3 dumbfounded ambassadors. Each cone had a drizzle of syrup from a bottle Jake always carried with him because he claimed you never knew when you'd need a sugar boost. The Peltar envoy absorbed the snow cone through its magnetic field and emitted a sound that translated to something like, "pleasant surprise." The Kit-Hari chittered in delight as the cold treat cooled their metabolism. The Euraxian ambassador slowly absorbed its portion and gurgled with contentment. "This is delightful," the Euraxian admitted. "What do you call this flavor?" "Blue," Jake said, grinning. "On Earth, if something is neon blue, we assume it's blueberry even if it tastes like cough syrup. It's part of our cultural heritage. So, about the asteroids, why don't you jointly operate a snow cone venture? The Kit-Hari can handle the paperwork, the Peltar can handle refrigeration, and the Euraxians can manage quality control because you guys are clearly sensitive to texture." He leaned back as if the problem were solved. There was a long pause. Then the Peltar envoy flickered. "We had never considered a joint business venture." We could standardize cones with six-sided flanges for easy stacking, the Kid Hari mused, already calculating profits. And we will have an excuse to sample every batch, the Euraxian said, its pseudopods wriggling happily. What had started as a potential war turned into a business meeting about color palettes and flavor profiles. By the end of the day, the Trinera Conflicts region had been renamed the Trinera Snow Cone Cooperative, and Jake had 6 new flavors named after him, including one that tasted like hope and another that tasted like regret. The warships were repurposed into ice haulers, and within weeks, the region had the most popular dessert in the quadrant. The official peace treaty included a clause that any future disagreements would be resolved by a taste test panel, and that no one would ever speak of the time they almost destroyed each other over frozen water. Jake's next accidental intervention occurred in the Varian cluster, home to the 12 singing moons. The moons were actually large, hollow planetoids that resonated when the solar wind blew through their porous surfaces, creating haunting melodies that could be heard across light years. The problem was that the moon of high G hashtag and the moon of low B were out of tune, causing disharmony in the cluster and irritation among the residents of the nearby planet, who claimed the dissonance was affecting their sleep. When Jake and Vexthra arrived, they were greeted by a group of musicians from 12 different species, each holding an instrument that looked more like a weapon than an instrument. Ambassador Vexthra, said Maestro Trillium, a being composed entirely of vibrating strings. The discord is unbearable. We must modify the moon's structure to adjust their resonance. Another musician, whose head was a translucent crystal, shook with anger. You can't just chisel away at a moon, they argued. The moons are sacred. They're mentioned in our oldest lullabies. Vexthra prepared to launch into a discussion about compromise when Jake interrupted. Have you tried tuning forks? He asked. The musicians looked at him in confusion, so he pulled out a small metal device from his pocket. On Earth, when we need to find a reference pitch, we use these. Maybe you could agree on a reference pitch for the moons and adjust your instruments instead of the moons. Our instruments are fine, Maestro Trillium vibrated indignantly. It's the moons that are wrong. On Earth, Jake said conversationally, we have a saying, the instrument is never out of tune. It's the player. He ignored the sound of a dozen musicians gasping in horror. Maybe, just maybe, you all need to learn how to play in different modes. There's more than one scale. If you play in the key of C, and the moons are in G hashtag, you'll get a tritone that makes you uncomfortable. But if you shift your key, you can create something interesting. The concept of changing keys in mid-composition was revolutionary to the Varian musicians, who had spent millennia perfecting a single scale. They argued for hours about the sanctity of their traditional modes, the complexity of their instruments, and the heresy of accidental modulations. Jake nodded politely, sipped his coffee, and occasionally offered insights like, on Earth, jazz musicians get excited when things clash, and dissonance can be spicy. Finally, Maestro Trillium sighed, which, for a string being, sounded like a harp being plucked at random. Perhaps there is merit in exploring other tonalities, they conceded. What did you call it? Jazz? What followed was a jam session unlike any in the galaxy's history. 12 species, each with their own instruments, began experimenting with chords, progressions, and rhythms that had never before been combined. They played around the moons, letting the natural resonance feed into their compositions. Dissonant notes that once caused anger now caused excitement. A new genre, immediately dubbed Galax, was born on the spot. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and utterly intoxicating. The moon of high G hashtag and the moon of low B were no longer considered out of tune. They were considered avant-garde. The peace treaty between the 12 musical guilds was signed on the back of a napkin from Jake's coffee thermos. It stipulated that dissonance was to be encouraged at least 10% of the time, that every composition had to include at least one unexpected key change, and that anyone caught complaining about the moons would be required to join a percussion circle for a minimum of 3 weeks. Vexthra later admitted it was the most entertaining treaty she'd ever witnessed. Word of Jake's interventions spread faster than a warp drive malfunction. Civilizations that had been at war for generations suddenly found themselves reconsidering their positions. Not because they suddenly cared about peace, but because they were terrified that a human might show up and do something weird that worked. The Council of Aquatic Nations, for example, had been arguing over water currents for decades. The council consisted of 14 species, all of whom lived in the same ocean on the planet Hydra 4. They had fought over territory, salinity levels, and whose ancestral songs were allowed to be sung at dawn. When Jake arrived, they were on the verge of blowing each other up with pressurized jets. "Heathen!" shouted Lord Ripplefin, a majestic serpentine creature with bioluminescent fins. "The sea belongs to the Ripplefin lineage. We control the currents." "Nonsense," countered Lady Coraline, a being made entirely of living coral. "We create the reefs that protect the shore. Without us, you'd wash away." "We provide the plankton," bubbled Representative Filtergill, a delicate creature with hundreds of tiny gills. "Without us, you'd all starve." Jake floated in the meeting chamber, an underwater dome filled with water and yet somehow still accommodating his need to breathe thanks to a human-sized breathing apparatus. "On Earth," he said, taking a breath through his mouthpiece, "we have something called a potluck dinner. People get together, read the same book, and then argue about what it means. Sometimes they get really mad. They throw wine. It's entertaining." "We do not read for entertainment," High Priestess Glorb said stiffly. "Our scripture is divine." "Fair," Jake said. "On Earth we've had holy wars too. They've lasted centuries. People killed each other over how to hold their hands while praying. What helped was separating the spiritual from the administrative. You can argue about the meaning of your texts, but maybe you can agree that fighting over buildings is silly. Why not build identical temples for each sect? Or rotate. One week it's yours, next week it's theirs. Or turn this one into a museum." "You cannot commodify the sacred," Prophet Zingu gasped. "Actually," Jake said, "you can. We call it tourism. People pay to see sacred spaces. You could fund your sects, educate others about your differences, and maybe realize you're not that different after all." The Poglians were scandalized. They debated for weeks. They argued about whether charging admission was sinful. They accused Jake of trying to make their gods into carnival attractions. Jake responded by describing the Vatican gift shop and the pilgrim trails in Mecca. He described Buddhist temples with donation boxes and Hindu temples with guided tours. The Poglians were horrified and fascinated. In the end, they agreed to create a pilgrim's route that included all their temples. Each sect would maintain its sacred spaces and provide guides who would explain their beliefs. They would also open a common library where texts from all sects could be studied. They didn't solve their theological differences, but they stopped killing each other. The treaty took the form of a pilgrimage map engraved on a massive stone slab. Jake kept a copy to use as a cheese board. Every new conflict taught Jake something new about the galaxy. He learned that the most valuable resource in the universe wasn't energy or territory. It was understanding. He also learned that there were species that would never fully trust each other, but if you could get them to laugh at the same joke or share the same meal, you had a chance at peace. He learned that the words "on Earth, we have this thing," were often the key to unlocking centuries of stubbornness. He learned that if you wanted to be taken seriously by beings that considered you a deathworlder, the best approach was humility paired with unshakable optimism. He also learned that he really liked alien food. At one point, he found himself on a gas giant's floating city, tasting cloud fruit dipped in antimatter sauce while explaining to two rival factions that fighting over ammonia extraction rights was silly because ammonia existed everywhere in the galaxy. He told them about Earth farmers who fought over water rights and how they solved it with irrigation agreements. The factions formed a union, created an extraction cooperative, and then invited Jake to be their guest of honor at the annual Cloud Fruit Festival. He accepted mainly because of the food. Another time, he mediated between two AI civilizations arguing over processor cycles. One AI, a sprawling network of satellites, claimed the other, a planet-sized supercomputer, was hogging all available frequency bands. "On Earth," Jake said, "we have something called bandwidth throttling." He explained how internet service providers limited speeds to ensure everyone could watch cat videos. The AIs were appalled by the concept of limiting data flow until he framed it as equitable distribution. They signed an agreement to allocate frequencies based on need and implemented a system of dynamic frequency scaling. They even created a shared digital space to discuss optimization strategies, which they named the Jake Murphy Protocol in his honor. As Jake's legend grew, so did the myths about him. Some species thought he was a demigod. Others were convinced he was a secret weapon created by Earth to destabilize the galaxy. Conspiracy theories circulated about a human cabal sending out ordinary people to end wars by accident. Jake found this hilarious and once made a t-shirt that said, "Galactic Cabal Training Program" in 17 languages. Not all the myths were flattering. The Ceranian Empire issued a proclamation declaring humans a plague and banning all Earth imports, including, to their citizens, horror, chocolate. The Ceranian Emperor, a being made of molten rock, claimed that Jake's cultural contaminants were destroying the purity of Ceranian tradition. He accused humans of weaponizing hospitality. He threatened to burn any human who set foot on Ceranian soil. Jake was on his way to mediate the nebular dispute of the dancing quasars when Vexthera received a message from the Ceranian Emperor. "Send us the human, or we declare war on Earth." The Emperor's voice rumbled, causing the hull of their shuttle to vibrate. "We can't let you go," Vexthera said firmly. "The Ceranians are serious." "Maybe that's the problem," Jake said, sipping his coffee. "They're too serious. On Earth, when someone says, 'Send me your champion,' we either send a wrestler or a diplomat with a sense of humor." "Jake," Vexthera warned, "this isn't a game." "No, it's a barbecue," Jake said, grinning. "Literally. The Ceranian Emperor invited me to dinner. I looked up their customs. When a Ceranian invites you, you bring an offering. I'm thinking marshmallows." The Ceranians had never encountered marshmallows. They had never seen anything like a soft, sweet, fluffy sugar pillow on a stick. When Jake arrived, wearing a heat-resistant suit and carrying a bag of marshmallows and a long skewer, the Ceranian court was confused. The Emperor glared at him, lava dripping from his chin. "Explain," he roared. "On Earth," Jake said, brandishing a marshmallow, "we have campfires. We roast these. It's a tradition. It's communal. It's a way to bring people together and tell stories. You guys live in volcanoes. You've got the best campfires in the universe." It seemed rude not to share. Curiosity is a powerful thing, even in lava beings. The Emperor watched as Jake carefully skewered a marshmallow and held it over a molten stream. Puffed up, browned, and nearly caught fire. Jake blew on it and offered it to the Emperor. There was a hiss as the marshmallow touched molten rock, but then the Emperor's expression, if you could read expressions in molten rock, changed from anger to confusion to pleasure. "It's sweet," the Emperor rumbled, "and gooey." He summoned his council, and soon the entire Ceranian court was roasting marshmallows over lava flows. They experimented with different levels of char. They debated optimal roasting distances. They created elaborate s'mores with cosmic chocolate and crackers made from condensed carbon. Jake told stories about Earth campfire traditions and ghost stories that made lava flicker in delight. By the end of the night, the Emperor declared that humans were no longer a plague. They were bearers of divine confections. He rescinded his proclamation, lifted the embargo on chocolate, and signed a trade agreement to import marshmallows from Earth. The treaty, written on obsidian tablets, stipulated that any future diplomatic disputes with humans would be settled through communal roasting sessions. Vexthera insisted on adding a clause requiring fire safety training for any visiting humans. Perhaps the most profound change happened when Jake received a message from Earth. It was from his old kindergarten class. The children, now teenagers, had been following his adventures. They sent him a video, all of them sitting in a circle, each one holding a sign that said, "Use your words." They had been monitoring galactic news and had questions. "Mr. Murphy, why do adults keep fighting? Do aliens have recess? When are you coming back?" Jake watched the video in silence. He realized that while he was out here convincing aliens to share and talk, he hadn't been home in years. He also realized that his students, his kids, had learned from his example. They were running conflict resolution workshops at their school. They had formed a student council dedicated to peace. They had even mediated a disagreement between the science club and the drama club about who got to use the auditorium. It hit him then that perhaps he had been looking at his job the wrong way. It wasn't about ending wars for the sake of ending wars. It was about teaching. He wasn't a diplomat or a bodyguard. He was a teacher on a field trip that had gotten wildly out of hand. He sent them a message back. "I'm proud of you. I'm going to finish my trip, and then I'm coming home. Save a seat for me at your peace club." He meant it. He planned to return to Earth, retire to a quiet life, maybe write a book about his adventures. But of course, the universe had other plans. The final conflict Jake inadvertently found himself involved in before he could return home was perhaps the strangest. It was called the Festival of Ends, an event held every 10,000 years by a coalition of ancient beings known as the Terminals. They believed that endings were sacred. They worshipped the concept of completion. Every 10 millennia, they gathered to celebrate the end of cycles, the collapse of stars, the decay of particles, the final page of a book. They invited representatives from every known species to witness and participate. Refusing was considered an insult, as endings were universal. Jake and Vexthera were invited as guests of honor, largely because the Terminals believed Jake represented the end of wars. They arrived at a world that was literally dissolving. The festival was held on a planet at the end of its life, its crust cracking, its atmosphere thinning. The Terminals had built platforms that hovered above the crumbling surface. There were speakers discussing entropy, artists creating sculptures that collapsed as soon as they were finished, and philosophers debating whether endings were real or just transitions. Jake found it fascinating and a little depressing. There were fireworks that were designed to be seen once and never again. There were musical compositions that dissolved into silence mid-performance. There were toasts to extinct species and lost languages. There was even a booth where you could write down your regrets, and the booth would burn them for you. At the center of the festival was a ritual called the Great Silence. For 1 hour, everyone and everything was supposed to be completely quiet, to honor the end of sound. If any sound was made, it would be considered an affront to the Terminal's belief system, and the festival would be deemed a failure. Jake sat next to Vexthera during the Great Silence, sipping water and trying to think about nothing. Halfway through, a small child from a species he didn't recognize began to cry. The child's mother tried to shush them, but the child wailed louder. People stared, horrified. The Terminals shifted in their seats. It looked like centuries of tradition were about to crumble because a toddler missed their nap. Jake stood up, took a deep breath, and began to whistle. A soft, lilting tune that he remembered from his childhood. It was a lullaby his mother used to hum when he couldn't sleep. The melody carried across the platform. The crying stopped. The child listened, hiccuped once, and then fell silent, eyes wide. People gasped. Jake ignored them. He continued to whistle, letting the notes fill the silence. Slowly, others joined in. A Zephyrian hummed low in their throat. A crystalline added a high harmonic. A human from the Earth delegation picked up a harmony. Soon, the Great Silence was a quiet symphony of species singing together. It wasn't silence, but it wasn't noise. It was acknowledgement that endings didn't have to be empty. They could be filled with something gentle, something comforting, something shared. When the hour was up, the head terminal approached Jake. "Why did you break the silence?" it asked, not angrily but curiously. "On Earth," Jake said softly, "silence can be scary, can feel like abandonment. Sometimes, when we honor endings, we do it with a sound that comforts us. A lullaby. I didn't want that child to remember the festival as the time everyone glared at them. I wanted them to remember a song." The terminal considered this. "Perhaps endings are not emptiness," it said. "Perhaps they are invitations to begin something else." The Festival of Ends did not consider the lullaby an affront. They considered it an evolution. Their next ritual would include a moment of communal humming. They wrote it into their sacred texts. The treaty that Jake signed at the festival was less a treaty and more a note scribbled in the margin of an ancient scroll. It read, "Endings can be soft." When Jake finally returned to Earth, the galaxy was different. The Zephyrians and Crystallins were still allies, though they bickered over flavor profiles at their joint mining cafes. The Draxian Sports League had a galactic following, with fans dressing in spiked armor to watch matches in arenas on neutral moons. The Spectrans had made entirely new forms of art that defied description. The Pyronian Flame Ledger had been updated to version 3.1.2. The Peltar, Kithari, and Euraxians were franchising their snow cones. Serenians were roasting marshmallows at religious ceremonies. As for Jake, he retired from official diplomacy, but his legend lived on. He returned to teaching, but his classroom was now a hybrid of Earth children and aliens. He taught conflict resolution, yes, but he also taught cooking classes where Zephyrian kids learned to make esmores, Pyronian students learned to make ice cream without melting it, and Crystalline kids learned to play marbles. He wrote a book titled, Use Your Words, Lessons from a Deathworlder, which became a bestseller on 8 planets. Ambassador Vexthera visited him on occasion. They would sit in his backyard, drink coffee. Jake had upgraded to a machine with more buttons than a Draxian wore suit, and reminisce about the chaos they'd survived. You changed the galaxy, Vexthera said once, looking up at the stars. We changed it, Jake corrected. You were there every step of the way, keeping me from doing anything too stupid. And yet you still did so much, Vexthera laughed. Jake, have you ever thought about how things might have gone if we hadn't met? Jake shrugged, smiling. Some other human would have eventually done something weird. Maybe they'd have brought cookies instead of coffee. Maybe they'd have started a galactic bake sale instead of a sports league. The galaxy is big. The possibilities are endless. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The thrill of negotiation, the adrenaline of almost getting vaporized, the look on people's faces when you ask for coffee in the middle of a war? Jake thought about it. He thought about the Trinera Snowcone Cooperative, the Varian Jam Sessions, the Draxian halftime shows, the Spectran light displays, the Pyronian algorithms, the Serenian campfires, the Chronosian time zones, the Poglian pilgrimage. He thought about the sigh of a terminal who realized that endings weren't empty. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I look at these kids, and I hear them telling a Kithari friend, use your words, and I think this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Vexthera nodded. I suppose the galaxy will just have to end wars without you. Nah, Jake said, grinning. They still send me snow cones. And besides, if they really need me, they know where to find me. I've got coffee. He raised his mug, took a sip, and smiled as he watched the sunset, content that endings were indeed invitations to begin something new. The nebular dispute of the dancing quasars was one of those conflicts that sounded more like the title of a romance novel than an actual territorial disagreement. The dancing quasars were a series of luminous phenomena at the edge of the Scion Nebula. To the naked eye, provided the eye belonged to a species that could withstand gamma radiation, they looked like twinkling stars performing an eternal ballet. In reality, they were quasars whose jets intersected in precisely choreographed patterns due to a combination of gravitational lensing and ancient megastructures built by a long-extinct civilization. Different clans of the Scion species had staked claims on the quasars based on stories passed down through song. The Heliaphons believed the quasars were the souls of their ancestors dancing. The Chronivels insisted they were celestial clocks counting down to their next migration. The metaphors argued they were, well, metaphors. When Jake and Vexthera arrived, tensions were high. Each clan had set up observation platforms at different points around the quasars, and there were heated arguments about who had the right to compose new songs inspired by them. In Scion culture, composing a song based on a celestial event granted you ownership rights over any resources within the event's gravitational sphere. Since the quasars' jets contained valuable energy, the clans had every incentive to claim them. Ambassador Vexthera sang elder resonance of the Heliaphons, their voice modulating with the rhythm of the quasars. We have always sung the quasars. They dance because we dance. Nonsense, buzzed Timekeeper Pulse of the Chronivels, their wings vibrating in complex patterns. We have always recorded the quasars' timing. They are clocks. Without our measurements, they would falter. You're both wrong, said Symbolist Echo of the Metaphors, a being whose body resembled a shifting cloud of hieroglyphs. The quasars are metaphors. Their meaning changes depending on who's looking. Vexthera rubbed her temples. Perhaps, she began. We could. On Earth, Jake interrupted. We have something called copyright law. The Scion leaders turned toward him, intrigued. If you write a song, it's yours. If you use someone else's song, you pay royalties. But there are also public domain songs that anyone can use. Maybe you could treat the quasars like the public domain. Anyone can sing about them, but if you make a new arrangement, you get credit. He could see the confusion on their faces. Let me put it another way. Share the quasars, but if someone creates a new interpretation, a new way to use them, you credit them. The Scions considered. They were a culture that valued creativity, but they'd never applied intellectual property concepts to celestial bodies. They debated whether songs could be owned and whether quasars could be copyrighted. Someone suggested splitting the quasars into segments and assigning each to a clan, which caused an immediate uproar because you can't divide a metaphor. Jake then proposed a festival. On Earth, we have film festivals, he said. People submit movies and they win awards. Why not have a quasar festival? Each clan can present their interpretation. Judges from neutral species can award prizes. The winner gets to host the quasars for the next cycle and collect any energy profits. The idea of turning a territorial dispute into a competition appealed to the Scions' artistic sensibilities. They loved festivals almost as much as they loved songs about festivals. They immediately began discussing categories: best traditional interpretation, best experimental use of jet, best visual integration with nebular dust. They argued about the judges. They debated whether beings who couldn't perceive gamma radiation should be allowed to vote. They ultimately decided on a diverse panel that included a blind poet, a colorblind painter, and a deaf percussionist, because in Scion philosophy, true appreciation came from what was beyond the senses. The first dancing quasar festival was chaotic and brilliant. The Heliophons performed a piece where they physically danced on platforms that resonated with the quasar jets, creating harmonic vibrations that could be felt across the nebula. The Chronivels presented a time-lapse composition that synchronized the quasars' pulses with their own biological rhythms. The Metaphors created a performance art piece where they used the quasars' light to project shifting hieroglyphs onto the nebular dust, telling a story that changed with every viewing. The festival was a resounding success. The clans agreed to hold it annually, and the quasars became a shared cultural heritage rather than a source of conflict. The treaty was a series of musical scores, each one a collaborative effort between the clans, with a final movement dedicated to Jake's.